You are about to listen to the full interview with Zack Van Eyck. Sections of it were originally included in our Skinwalker Ranch episode. If you haven't listened to the full episode, we recommend you go listen. It'll provide context for this interview. Zack was the original reporter who broke the story about Skinwalker Ranch and had the opportunity to speak directly to the Shermans.
I'm a longtime journalist. I'm a screenwriter as well, and started my journalism career actually when I was 14 as a sports writer for the Anchorage Times in Alaska, and was a high school sports writer throughout those 4 years and won a scholarship to Vanderbilt University as a result. And I loved sports writing, but it was, it was a late night job. And so when I got married, my now ex-wife said, this is kind of ridiculous. You need to start writing news. You need to do something that isn't going to bring you home so late. So I did transition over to news. And at first there were a lot of late nights with that too. But I'd always been interested in UFOs and the paranormal. When I was in school here in Virginia back in the early 70s, they showed us Chariots of the Gods, and I think that was my first exposure. Also, the psychic Edgar Casey that some people may be familiar with. It's been a while now since he's passed away, but my grandfather was Edgar Casey's minister in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and my mom was actually born in Virginia Beach. And so when we used to go to the beach when I was a kid, we would hang out with Edgar Casey's family, not Edgar, but his sons. And the Casey readings have a lot of astrology. That's kind of how I got into astrology. I'm also a professional astrologer. And he had a lot in there about alien races and whatnot. So that piqued my interest. So I've always had this interest. And so when I was in Oregon in my 20s and I was still a sports writer, there was something on the news about a guy down in Sutherland, Oregon, about an hour and a half south of Eugene. I was at the University of Oregon at the time, who supposedly had contact with these Bigfoot-like creatures who were alien, and they took him to Venus, and it was on the local news. And I'm just a college student at that point. I'm like, wow, that's really exciting. I'm going to go talk to this guy. So I drove an hour and a half south and just, said, hey, I'm interested, and interviewed the guy. I was really disappointed. He was obvious. I mean, he was kind of a simple guy, older guy, logger, who just really liked the attention because his whole story just, it just didn't make it. It was too childlike, and it looked like something an old guy who wants attention would make up. So that was kind of disappointing, but, it was kind of a good litmus test for me to really just break through all the garbage. And of course, as a journalist, it's like you ask tough questions, you grill people, you get a sense, and a lot of that is their energy and everything. I mentioned that just because when I interviewed the Shermans years later, it was just obvious that they were telling the truth. And that's partly, I harken back to this interview of the Bigfoot guy because it's like, it took a little bit, but it was pretty apparent after a few questions that, it just wasn't real. So anyway, so I become a news writer, and this happened in New Mexico. I was working actually in news in Virginia, got a job in 91 at the late 91 at the Santa Fe, New Mexican, and was working sports originally. And then won an award for one of my sports investigative reports, and the managing editor, Rob Dean, who has since passed away, but he was awesome. He said, Zach, I want you to move over to news, and I want you to become an enterprise reporter. And they would just hand me like projects, and I would spend a couple weeks on them, right? So we did like this really extensive 2-week report on hunger and poverty in northern New Mexico, which was really revealing and sad, but, worthwhile journalistically. I did a lot on the Indian gaming situation because there were a bunch of pueblos in northern New Mexico at that time that were trying to get gaming compacts with the government. And then this ended up being another story I did sort of very late in 94, before I got the job at the Deseret News in Salt Lake. And it was all about the cattle mutilations and UFO flap that was happening in northern New Mexico between 91 and 94. And, there's a lot of stuff going on in the San Luis Valley, just north of northern New Mexico. There was a lot of stuff going on in Taos. I think it was our sister paper in Taos that started covering UFOs. And then Rob was like, we need to look into this further. One of the cases, there was this sheriff's deputy who went on the record and gave me the name of the rancher. His name is Larry Gardia. And this guy, Larry, was out bear hunting. This was the fall of 94. And he came across he saw about a dozen cattle that were running. And then he came at, a very thickly wooded area. Okay. And he came across 3, I think they were all calves, or one was a calf. I think the others were cows. Anyway, there were three of them. One was floating through the air, okay, sort of being drawn by some kind of invisible beam, and he could hear a sound, but didn't see anything in the trees, but just a sort of a humming sound. No light, okay, associated, not like a light beam, but something that was drawing this calf through. So he had his gun, so he shot twice in the direction of where the humming sound was coming from, in the direction of where the cow was being drawn. And the cow fell immediately, hit the ground. The sound went away. He never did see anything, but he was freaked out, so he ran. And there were two other cows sort of that were in the process, I guess. Like one was like on its knees and was bawling but couldn't move, and there was another one that couldn't move. So he came back, and they fed. Let's see, the first cow that he saw was actually still there. It was mutilated. The other two were gone. Came back with the sheriff's deputy. But that was an interesting case just because it had the sound beam, and somebody actually saw a cow going through the air. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and that was one of the cases towards the end of my tenure there that was really interesting. But there were basically 46 cattle mutilations in northern New Mexico in 93 and 94. That's how many we were able to. And two of them were primarily the two cattle owners were two ranchers who had a lot of head of cattle, and they were pretty far away from each other, like maybe 100 miles or so. And I think one rancher had about 15 head that were mutilated. The other had maybe a dozen, and then all the others were like small ranchers. And that's kind of what I did with that story is I would go talk to these small ranchers, because in northern New Mexico you have a lot of families that have maybe 8 to 10 head of cattle, and they live off of that. And if they lose a cow, that's a lot of money. And that, makes a difference between making a profit and eating well over the winter, et cetera. So these guys, they would see lights in the sky, and they would hear something, and they would go out the next morning, or they would go out at that time, find their cow was mutilated. So you lost a cow, you saw some lights, you can't explain it. This happened repeatedly in northern New Mexico, and I talked to the local ranchers who had this happen, and there was no support from the government. That's another thing we did. There was a study commissioned in New Mexico in 1980. Ken Rommel did. You can look it up. Rommel. He was a former FBI guy, I think. Basically, it was he was paid a lot of money by the state because they had a lot of ranchers who were calling in saying our cows are being mutilated, and he basically concluded. And this was earlier. This was over the 75 to 1980 flap that happened in northern New Mexico, in Colorado. So this goes back a bit, but basically his conclusion that it was toxic weeds, blowflies, and other predators that were, it was just ridiculous.
That's funny because when reading about the cattle mutilations in Utah, I mean, I see lots of people giving that exact word for word answer as the explanation. Yeah. It seems like that explanation, even though it was given about the situation in New Mexico, has stuck for pretty much any cattle mutilation that is found across the country.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And I think to a large degree, that's why we didn't really see a lot of cattle mutilations in the 80s, or at least they weren't recorded, because I'm working, of course, this is 94 by the time I'm getting to it, and going back and looking at it. But I think that report just kind of silenced a lot of people, and the ranchers just said, there's no point in telling anybody. Well, anyway, but my point is that I spent a great deal of time and energy on that. And then after that series came out, I think I was there in Santa Fe for a few more months, and I did follow-up stories like the Larry Garcia one I told you about, because people started calling me after that series. It was like, hey, I saw this, I had this happen, So anyway, so now we're at the end of 94, and we had a baby on the way, and we were living in an apartment that was much cheaper than it should have been, because it was owned by a guy who worked at the paper. Because northern Mexico is really, for journalists to afford to live in Santa Fe. We lived in San Miguel County. We lived in Pecos. We were like 35 minutes away, just because we couldn't afford Santa Fe. But so this person who was renting the apartment, he was living in town with his girlfriend. They broke up. He's like, hey, I kind of need to get back into my place. So I have a toddler and a pregnant wife who's about to give birth in 6 weeks, and I've got to get out of this house. So I basically did an extensive job search everywhere west of the Mississippi, which is where my ex-wife was willing to go. And this first round, I just didn't get anything. And I was working off the editor and publisher yearbook that they used to have that listed all of the newspapers. And so I had applied to the Salt Lake Tribune, and I hadn't noticed, because there was a joint operating agreement between the two papers, that the Deseret News, I didn't even know it existed, but it was listed much further down after the Tribune. So I realized, weeks after I'd written what I thought was every paper in the West, I had skipped the Deseret News. So I wrote them, and I got a call like right away. And I had just talked to people in Montana about working for them, and the salary was just awful. And so when Rick Hall, who was the city editor at the time for the Deseret News, and Rick did end up hiring me, he was later the managing editor for a long time, great guy, recently retired. But when Rick got on the phone and he said he was going to hire me, I'm like, yeah, how much are you going to pay me? And it was really good. It was really good. And I always joke that the reason Deseret News pays so much is because, Mormon-owned paper, so they figured most of their workers would have to give 10% tithing to the church, and they might have more than one wife, or certainly 5 or 6 kids. So I loved working for that paper, very well paid, happy to be there. And when I got the job, I told them about they had read a lot of my enterprise reporting for New Mexico. That's really what got me the job, including the cattle mutilation stuff. And I knew it was a Mormon-owned paper, so I thought at least they would be receptive to the idea of UFOs and aliens, and probably wouldn't be, every newspaper depends on your ownership in terms of what you're allowed to cover or not. And so I thought, hey, there's probably stuff happening here too. So when I got the job, I told them that, and then I became a suburban reporter for 2 years. So from 94 to 96, I was basically just covering local government, but I still had this keen interest in UFOs, paranormal, obviously. And I got to know Mildred Beasley, who was the MUFON director of Utah at the time. And Mildred, I think, was in her mid to late 80s at that time. She's no longer with us, but Mildred was great. And she lived not far in Cottonwood, not far from the cities that I was covering. So often I would just go by and hang out with Mildred for a half hour and talk about UFOs in Utah and everything, just for fun, just because it was my own interest. And I met a few people through her, and she told me about a lot of stories. So I kind of knew that there was stuff going on, but I didn't press it with my bosses. It really wasn't that big of a deal to me. I mean, if I'm assigned something like that, it's great, but I can do whatever. And we were just happy to have a good job that was supporting me, a wife who didn't work, and 2 kids, right? So I'm not gonna make waves. So then Rick and the other editors came to me in June of 96. Probably May. It was probably end of May or early June. And they said, this movie Independence Day is coming out on the July 4th weekend, and we would like to localize it, which papers always do, right? You have something big that's happening in the world, you try to localize it. So they're like, hey, why don't you go out and see if there are some UFO cases here locally that we can write about? And of course, there were many of them, and the original story lists a lot of those, but it focuses primarily on the Shermans. But anyway, so I already knew about Frank Salisbury's book. Frank Salisbury, who's also passed, but he did, it was called the Utah UFO Display. It came out in 1974, and he did an abridged version in 2010, and I highly recommend it. Frank basically, essentially his work led me to find out about the Shermans, because the guy that Frank based most of the book on was the research of Joseph Jr. Hicks, who was the now legendary, he just passed last year, actually, I believe at age 90, or maybe thereabouts. But he was the guy that everyone locally in the Uinta Basin, in fact, Junior told me, he said he thinks about, he thought about 10% of the Uinta Basin population in Utah, eastern Utah, had seen something themselves. I mean, that's pretty big, 10%. And I think if you add in the people who know somebody who saw something or had an experience, it's probably a lot larger. But anyway, so Junior, between 70 and 75, and this was featured in, or 70 and 74, featured in Frank's book, Junior, and I guess this was in the 60s as well, he created, I think there were 400 cases that he had documented of people coming in, telling him what they had seen. 7 of those 400, first of all, let me back up, because I know there were over 1,000 cases of people who had come to Junior over those 3-4 decades and said, I saw this is what happened. Now, out of those 1,000, 400 basically were good enough to make the book, or were substantial enough where he felt like they were unexplained. And then out of those 400, there were 7 in which the witnesses saw a creature or a being either in a craft, like through the portals, through the windows, or outside of a craft. So there were 7 that were like that. And I believe I spoke to one of those people in the original story. So, there's a lot going on out there. So Junior was the guy to talk to. So I went out to the basin, did a long interview with Junior. He was kind of hesitant because he didn't really want to get it. I mean, it's just kind of a no-win situation because you're the local UFO guy and everybody reports things to you, and then people come to you and say, hey, what do you think? And he just kind of, I think, had enough of it, but he was very, very cordial and did agree to speak with me, and we had a long interview, and he gave me some people to talk to, and so I spent a whole day out there. And so I was about to leave, and I called him back to thank him, and I said, Junior, this is great. Thank you. I've talked to a lot of people who've seen things, but most of these things are things that happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I said, I can't believe with all this activity that it has really calmed down so much, right now in 1996 at that time. So I said, and this is a good reporter always asks follow-up questions. So I was like, before I let you go, Junior, are you sure there's not anything like local that's happening recently? Like, is there anything current? And he paused for a long time, long enough that I thought he was no longer on the line. And he said, well, you might want to call Gwen down at the bank. And it was with those words that this story happened, because I was on the phone 5 minutes later before I left town, talked to Gwen Sherman, who had worked at one of the banks in town for 20 years. She was from the area. She and her husband, Terry had moved to the Uinta Basin when he was 17 from Arizona, so they were entrenched there in the community. He had an advanced degree in animal husbandry and wanted to create his own hybrid line of cattle, which kind of works into this too, because all of the cows that were either mutilated or disappeared on the ranch in those 2 years were the hybrid cattle. He had other cattle too, but it was the expensive hybrid cattle that the mutilators apparently were interested in. But anyway, so Gwen was kind of at the end of her rope, and I feel like this was really meant to happen because I had so many. I had like a 7-page list of phone numbers of people in New Mexico who had very similar things happen to them, and that's the first thing I did was, I gave them some numbers. I said, here are some people you can call. I think Terry called people on my list before I even came out and interviewed him. I came out a few days later. But Gwen was, sort of at the end of the rope and wasn't sure if Terry wanted to talk to the media. And I said, look, I understand that, but I think this is incredible. People need to know that this is happening. And I can tell you that the same thing is happening in northern New Mexico. Here's a long list of people you can call. And so they were able to get, at least some comfort that they weren't alone. And then the other big part of this was that when I was doing the stories in New Mexico, of course, Art Bell was doing his Dreamland every Sunday night and then Coast to Coast during the week. And I used to get off work pretty late, and I'd listen to Coast to Coast on the way home, so I was aware of that. I used to listen to Linda Moulton Howe and her interviews on there. And so, and I did know Linda. I'd been in touch with her during the New Mexico situation because she was actually in northern New Mexico investigating them as well. So, and I knew that she had a grant. She was working under a grant from Robert Bigelow. And I knew a little bit about Robert Bigelow. Nobody knew a lot, but he was kind of seen as sort of a secretive character who had money, who was interested in studying UFOs. So I actually, I think even when Junior mentioned the ranch to me, gave me a few details, I'm like, even before I talked to Gwen, I'm like, oh man, Robert Bigelow is going to buy this place. I just felt strongly. And that was the thing, that the Shermans were looking to get out. I mean, they had paid, I know that they sold the ranch to Bigelow for $200,000. I believe they paid about $240,000. I know they took a loss on it. And of course, Bigelow's a shrewd businessman, and he has since now sold the ranch for $4.5 million, I think is what it was. And of course, in the early days, people wondered if he was like part of the government. Well, he became part of the government because he ended up giving a $22 million contract to study UFOs and paranormal. But anyway, so there initially it was just, it was a good fit because they were willing to go on the record. I was able to give them a lot of resources. And within 3 weeks of the time that the article came out, Bigelow, along with Jacques Vallée and some other people, was on the ground on the ranch, and they bought it that August. So I feel really good about it from the standpoint that, I helped get a family out of a situation that they were not comfortable with because they had put up with this stuff for almost 2 years at that point and just were at the end of their rope and didn't know what to do. And it just seemed like Robert Bigelow was the obvious guy to come in. So I'm real happy about how all of that has worked out, and I'm glad that it has been studied and it continues to be studied. I know that the Shermans initially got a little, flack from the community, and the kids were teased a little bit when it became public, but they also had a lot of people who came forward to them and said, hey, this is going on. We've had this happen too, or something similar. And I know they had visits from a guy who, this was after the article and they were still living on the ranch, a naval officer from North Carolina who gave Terry his card. I never saw the card, but they told me about it. And he was quite interested, and then seemed to be supportive, government. And then he disappears, doesn't show up. There was a white truck that had a different license plate every time, and it was just kind of sitting out there watching the ranch for a while. And Terry figured it out. He took pictures of the license plate. He had a friend who worked up at in the traffic pool at Hill Air Force Base, and he was able to find out that the car was registered to Hill, and he actually went out and talked to the guy, I believe. So Hill Air Force, the Air Force sent somebody down there to look around. The Navy was apparently poking around. He had some guys from sort of anti-government folks from Michigan who came down there and told him it was a CIA plot and he needed to get off the land, and they had a guy show up. There was a guy who showed up who just like a hippie guy that really wanted to commune, just kind of be there. And so he like goes out in the field and he does this thing and Terry's watching him. And then there's like something like, was Predator the movie? I didn't see it, the one where the being disappears, right? So it was kind of like that, where he saw this individual saw something coming at him, but it was like only half physical. It wasn't completely materialized. And it scared the hell out of him, and he left, and they never saw him again. But, those kinds of things. So that, but anyway, so when I I went out there. In fact, I made Carmen, our photographer. This is like 3.5 hours from Salt Lake, right? 3.5 hours. So if you're a paper and you're sending out a writer and a reporter, you would normally send them together. But I'm like, dude, I'm going to be there as long as I can. So why don't you take your own car? And so Carmen did, and she was there about 25 minutes, and then I was there about 3 hours. And I was on the ranch, but nothing happened. I didn't feel anything unusual. I just, got great information from Terry. And Terry told me right up front, he said, I'm not going to tell you everything. And the one big thing that happened early on that he didn't mention to us but came out later was, I think David Perkins got this in his article in Spirit Magazine, which is online. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it was about the large wolf dog-like creature that they saw very early on, and Terry shot it, I believe, 8 times, and didn't do anything to the creature, and it looked really big. And and this was like the first of many different types of animals that they saw that just didn't seem to belong there, like a big cat, like a jungle cat was up in a tree. Terry shot at something that he described as like a velociraptor because he saw that it had like 3-toed like claw marks on the ground, and it also like went up in a tree. And most of these things just kind of like disappear. So really interesting stuff. So anyway, so when I'm out there talking to Terry, at the end, I'm like, Terry, if you left some stuff out, I don't know what you left out, but this is more than enough. Because basically what because I mean, I see his reasoning because, a prehistoric wolf that won't be shot is one thing. But then seeing UFOs in the sky is another thing because people are used to it. So I can understand why he left that out. But basically, there were so many interesting things that happened there. And it just, the 3 different types of craft that they were seeing, these small 6-foot like box light, like a refrigerator flying through the air. Then there was like a and they had a white light on the front. And then there was the second vehicles were like 40 to 60 feet long, and they had short wings, and they would emit like a red light that would go onto the ground. And Terry thought it was like some sort of grid that they were following, like going over like maybe looking for something. I don't know, but this was something they saw with their infrared sights from their front porch. It was over in the second pasture, and above the ridge, there were these, and this is probably the most famous thing from the ranch that people are aware of, I think, is when these large portals opened up in the sky. And Terry and Grin both said that they would like spiral open, okay? And there were up to 4 windows in the sky, and they were like 100 feet across. That was just their estimate. And these 4 windows, not all of them were all open at the same time, but when they were always at the same location to each other. And behind, on the other side, you could see like a different sky, like it was an auburn color, like something, totally different background from where they were coming. And these were the ships that, they saw more than a dozen one night come out and kind of fall, they came out of those holes above the ridge, came down over the second pasture and did this grid pattern with the red wavy lines, like they were looking for something. And they watched this, and then the ships would go back into the into the holes of whatever this was. And so it's like, okay, is that a cloaked or somehow invisible ship where we're only seeing the windows and what we're seeing is the other side of the ship, and it's a massive ship? Because they did see like a mile long, just giant UFOs come up behind the ridge. So maybe it was cloaked or something. Or are those portals to another dimension? I mean, all that's been talked about and discussed. So, but I think that was probably the most interesting thing. But there were so many little things, and this poltergeist type activity too. Like Gwen, there was one night when she simply went into the bathroom to take a shower. She brought her towel in and some other personal items, and she locked the door, and then showered, got out of the shower, and the towel and her personal items were gone. I'm not sure where she found them, but they weren't in the bathroom, which was locked. Okay, weird, right? She had a couple other things like that too when they were living there. She brought the groceries home one day and put them up, and then she went to another room and came back like 5 minutes later, and on the kitchen counter, all of the groceries were back in bags, totally repacked differently, but she had just put them up. It's like, okay, does someone want me to think I'm losing my mind? What's going on? Their son had stacked an entire cord of wood, came inside, went out 30 minutes later, and the entire cord of wood was restacked 100 yards away in a different location. Okay. There was an incident too where Terry and I believe it was his nephew, because his daughter, I think their daughter was about 9 or 10. This is a 2-year period, 94 to 96. Their son was, I think, 12 or 13. And I think he had a nephew that was about 15. So I think Terry was with the nephew, and they were out. This is one of the fairly early incidents where they were just out on the pasture, and they heard voices talking like above them, like 25 feet above. They couldn't see anything. There was like a tree there. And Terry described the voices as being, there were two. He described them as male. One had a much deeper voice than the other, and they were talking in some kind of language that Terry said was very choppy, and he likened it to sort of a cross between a Native American language and Russian. And I joked about it being Klingon, and he laughed. But anyway, so what they heard this strange language, and so Terry decided just to, looking up, it said, "We can hear you." And one of the voices, the one with the lower voice, just started laughing, like a rolling laugh. And then apparently the conversation between the two disembodied voices continued for a little bit, and the dogs got freaked out, of course. Very interesting. So, there's a lot going on in terms of, is there a manipulation of time and space here? What are we dealing with? And I do have some of my own theories.
So maybe we take a step back and I'd love to hear from you, like what that first conversation with the Shermans was like when you first called them. How did that conversation go, and what was their reaction to talking about this with you?
Well, I think Gwen was interested in talking to a reporter because, both she and Terry were just trying to stick it out, basically. But they really were at the end of their rope, because at that point he had already showed the property to a family, but he didn't want to sell it to a family, and also to a hunting club that wanted to come out and hunt, and he didn't feel safe about that. So I think Gwen in particular was really interested in getting the story out. I suppose just because they were so desperate and needed help, and just were sick of going it alone, and it was just like, hey, it's time for people to know about this kind of thing. And then, so I don't know if she talked Terry into it, or if, what, but he was, like I said, he was resident to talk about certain things, but he showed, like when I was out there, you could see the really big scoops in the ground where, some of it had eroded, but there were, when they first moved in, they found like this triangular pattern of circles that were about 2 feet deep, cut into the pasture, and they were like 8 feet wide, the circles, 8 feet around, and then they were 30 feet from each other in a triangular pattern, obviously suggesting, okay, is this like a triangular landing pod or something? Because that's kind of what it looked like. And then there were other places out in the pasture where these big scoops of ground had been taken, and it looked like someone had removed a tree, but there were never any trees out there in the middle of the pasture, that kind of thing. So they took me around and showed me stuff. But yeah, Terry was, I think Terry was concerned about, to some degree, about what, that's what I say. He didn't tell me everything. But they were great. They were great. And I think I did as much as Terry would tell me. I would then relate a case from New Mexico or something that I was familiar with and say, well, that's consistent with this, or that's consistent with that. or Linda Moulton Howe has written about that, or, that kind of stuff. So it went really well because and it was good, that I had a background. I think if I had been just any reporter assigned to it, I mean, obviously I wouldn't have come across it, I think, but so yeah, I had no problem with it. It was great. And I did a follow-up interview, and then of course, so here's what happened. I'll tell you a little more about what happened right after that. So I had been in touch with Ryan Layton, who is an investigator in Utah. Ryan's a great guy. I met him through Mildred Beasley, and when I first started working on the story, I contacted Ryan, and some of the people that ended up being in the original article that were not the Shermans were people that Ryan had told me about and I interviewed, and it was great. So he was in touch with Linda Moulton Howe. Like I said, I had talked to Linda Moulton Howe 2 years before, and of course Linda is probably the preeminent paranormal journalist on the planet, and her website is great, and she was working, she was on Art Bell every Sunday night. So Ryan was really excited. He's like, oh my gosh, because once I found out about the Sherman Ranch, I'm like, hey Ryan, all these tips you gave me, I got a story that beat it. Let me tell you, okay? So he was going to call Linda Moulton Howe the minute the article came out, and I agreed to that with him. And so once it was set up and everything, I let him know. And so I think, June 30th, 96, the article comes out, and I'm sure the minute he got up, he called Linda, which was fine, because I wanted to break this story, and then everybody else can have at it and add to it, which is great. And so Linda then had Terry on for a full hour on the first hour of Dreamland that next Sunday night, which is July, whatever that was. July. In fact, I've got the transcript here. It's really great. It should be on Linda Moulton Howe's website, but
yeah, I got to find that. I haven't heard that yet, actually. I need to find that.
Yeah, it is really good. It just says it's copywritten 2004 by Linda Moulton Howe, even though it was much earlier than that, but it should be online. And he didn't give a whole lot of new information, but a little bit. But that really got it out there. And the other thing that happened, too, is that, in fact, I heard, I was out in the yard working the day that the article, I'm trying to think if it was, I guess it was the next weekend, because July 4th weekend was the big Independence Day, right? The movie coming out. So I'm not sure what radio network it was, but it was Mutual or one of those CBS, somebody that goes all over the place, right? And it was, I just had the radio on. I think it was sports radio, and the little kicker, the little button at the end of the newscast, after they mentioned Independence Day and its opening day weekend or whatever, and said, oh, and speaking of UFOs, there's a family in Utah that says they have been visited by, and that was international radio. So it really started to pick up and go. And then before Bigelow bought it, David Perkins, whose article is in Spirit Magazine, it's online. I highly recommend everybody read it, because I think David interviewed Terry after Bigelow came into the picture. I believe that's true, because his article didn't come out until about 6 months after mine, and I'm not sure how he got that interview. I'm glad he did, because as soon as the Sherman signed with Bigelow, they weren't talking to anybody anymore. But David's article has a lot of detail. And then Ryan Layton was really excited, so he went out and met him a couple of times and said, hey, I want to talk to you, and got more information. And then Chris O'Brien, who is great. I've met Chris a couple of times. He's the guy who, the Mysterious Valley, the San Luis Valley, he's written several books about it, all the UFO sightings and everything. And so he talked to the Shermans as well. So there was a wealth of information that was out before Bigelow came in, and then Bigelow sort of put an end to that. And then finally, after they had been out there for 2 years, they, meaning the National Institute for Discovery Science, which Bigelow had founded in 95, so it was perfect. That's exactly what they were looking for. And he brought his people out there, but they were very secretive about it at first. But then 2 years later, summer of 98, the paper sent me down, because we've been trying to get Bigelow. We tried to get an interview with him or a picture of it. We didn't even know what his middle initial was. It's middle initial T. But back then, before the widespread internet and stuff, it was hard to really get as much information as you can now. So we were after him. So 2 years, finally, he's like, they haven't released anything about what's going on in there, but he agrees to a face-to-face interview. And the reason he agreed really is because they, at that point, decided that what they needed to do was have a hotline number, so that anybody in the Uinta Basin who had any kind of counter mutilation or UFO activity or whatever could call them, and the scientists could go check it out. So they finally realized, oh, we need the press. We need people, So he still wouldn't allow us to take his picture, but I went down and wrote a long article on him and spent a lot of time with him in Vegas. And he actually offered me a job working for NIDS, but it was about the same money as Deseret News, and my wife was not having it. So, but I often wonder, and she didn't want to live in Vegas either. But I often wonder if I had taken that job, how things might have turned out differently.
That would have been a cool job. That would have been a very cool job.
I mean, I'm happy with how my life went, but yeah, I got to meet Colin Kelleher and Eric Davis. Eric Davis is amazing. I really connected with him. He was one of the physicists who was working for NIDS, and I think they did their best, and I think Bigelow is not maybe the most patient person, even though they were out there for like 6 years. But it's like, okay. It was like watching a kettle, and it just wasn't, that kind of thing. I think he did have some stuff that happened, and then I don't know. I think Bigelow, he went on to his Bigelow Aerospace, which I'm curious about now because I know they laid off everybody during COVID, and I don't know if they're coming back or not. That's a whole interesting thing, but.
He also has his Life After Death Institute he's doing as well, research for life after death.
Which he told me about in 98, and that's actually. When he founded NIDS, that was sort of the other half of NIDS, was that life after death thing. He had a son that died early, and so he was always interested in that. And his UFO experience, I'll tell you this real quick. So the reason he really got into that was that when he was a kid in the 50s, he said there was like nothing to do in Vegas. And so, small town back then. And the only thing to do for fun was to drive down the street and get ice cream. And so this one night, apparently his grandparents, he was not with him, but his grandparents drove down to get ice cream, and there was this they were just, I don't know what road they were on, but there was this fireball kind of thing that was like flying straight at them, like coming at them, and they swerved off the road thinking for sure there was going to be an impact, and then the object just like came really, really close. It was like on fire, a fireball, and then it just like made a turn, 90-degree turn, and went up into the sky, and it just really made an impact on his grandparents, and they told him that he was 8 at the time. And when he was 10, 2 years later, they told him the story. And I think from that point, he said he was pretty much hooked and wanted to find out what it was all about because he had a personal family encounter with it. So, so I think it's great that Bob came in and relieved the Shermans of the ranch. And I'm glad Brandon has it now because, here we are on the second season of Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. I think it's good, although, I'm not that excited to watch the second season because I've seen these guys talk about it and they're promoting it. And I'm like, well, okay, but if anything really significant happened, wouldn't we know about it by now?
Right. Exactly. That's the problem. That's the problem with shows like that. Is like, if they did catch something, we'd already have heard about it. But I do want to ask you about, you mentioned Jacques Vallée. Did he went to the ranch at some point?
Yeah, that's what we were told. Just that initial trip, I think he flew him in there in July of '96.
Do you know much about his visit and kind of what happened when he was there?
I know there were a couple of other people who were in the field too. I think Hal Puthoff may have been there too. Some of these guys that Bigelow already had with him, excuse me, in NIDS. John Alexander, of course, was part of NIDS, and I actually I talked to John on the phone when I was in New Mexico because John Alexander, of course, had been the head of non-lethal weapons at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is very close to where I was in Santa Fe. And in fact, I met his wife when I was in New Mexico because she came to deliver some stuff that he was interested in, and they were good sources for what was going on in New Mexico. And then I ended up meeting him in '98 in Vegas, and I really liked John a lot. In fact, I do want to mention real quick the book that John wrote that came out fairly recently, I think a couple years ago. It's called Reality Denied. And it's by John B. Alexander, Ph.D. And if you go to the very first chapter, it says the NIDS experience. And John talks all about like the dogs, which we haven't talked about yet, the dogs that were zapped. The family lost their 3 dogs because these blue orbs apparently zapped them into nothingness, little piles of apple butter. But anyway, John's book elaborates quite a bit on, and I think it's better than, Hunt for the Skinwalker is good. The Colin Kelleher book, that was the 2005 book, the George Knapp, which pretty much put it on the map. But I really like Reality Denied. And John Alexander talks about a whole bunch of different cases too, not just the Sherman Ranch. So I would highly recommend that.
I'll have to read that one. I have to throw it out there because I know I said only an hour, but I have so much more I want to ask you. Do you have time to go over the hour, or are you going to have a hard out at
I'm good.
15 minutes? Awesome. I appreciate that. Could you talk to a little bit more on the credibility of Terry and Gwen when you first talked to them? Like, what was their credibility like as witnesses?
Yeah, when I first met Terry, Terry is like a salt-of-the-earth guy, just a normal human being who just wants to raise his family out in the Uinta Basin where he had lived for a long time and had relatives. He wanted to breed cattle. And he's a very sincere guy. And you could tell that Terry, he just wanted it to go away. There was, you know, and that's why I think they were reluctant to really come forward, because they just wanted to live a normal life. They just wanted it to go away, and they didn't understand what was going on. And the fact that he was hesitant to say a lot at first, and just sort of the way he said everything, and you knew this isn't a guy, it's not a guy who's doing it for publicity. He just wants the problem to go away. And ultimately that's what happened, because we wrote the story, and Bigelow, you know, ended up buying the ranch. But yeah, and Gwen was stressed because, and she ended up actually losing her job at the bank, but she was stressed about that because people in the community would talk to her at the bank about UFOs, and then her boss would be, oh, she's chatting about UFOs for 5 minutes when she should be working, that kind of stuff. So that became a stressor for them. And then again, the kids in school were kind of hearing it. So all of that stuff, I mean, and again, this is a ranch out in the middle of nowhere. There's no way you're going to invite a reporter out and make up some incredible story, for your own profit, your own benefit? I mean, how did they behave after that? As soon as they got the non-disclosure, they disappeared. They went to Idaho, and I think they're back in. I've heard they're back in eastern Utah now, and at some point I might want to get back in touch with them. But they didn't want the publicity. They wanted it to go away, and of course there's some evidence of the phenomena sort of following you, if you will. So I think they wanted to get away from it as much as they could. So yeah, I never questioned their credibility at all. I mean, Junior Hicks was a big part of it, because everybody respects Junior, and he had covered so many cases, and he felt it was just the most extraordinary case that he'd heard of in the Uinta Basin in terms of a lot of concentrated activity around one property. And actually, the guy who lives right next to the Sherman, lived right next to, in fact, I think they still may be there, but it's a guy named John Garcia, and I knocked on the door when I was there, because the Shermans I don't think they told me anything, but they said you might want to talk to the neighbors. And I tried to get into, I think a woman came to the door and she slammed it real quick. And then I just didn't, I told her who I was and what I was interested in. They didn't want to talk to me, but I found out right after that from the Uinta County Sheriff's Department that John Garcia, in fact, had reported 2 cattle mutilations in that 95-96 year. So their neighbor right next door, they had a couple of them too. And the Shermans during those 2 years had a total of 4 cattle mutilations, and then 4 others that disappeared, 4 cows that disappeared. And, 5 that disappeared, 1 they got back. It was in a ranch, the very next day it was in a ranch, on a ranch, 20 miles away. How does that happen? And that one got returned to them, which is fortunate. But yeah, I never questioned their integrity. They did not ask for this. They did not want to be a part of it.
When people hear about cattle mutilations, I'm sure they think that, it's probably a wild animal or something like that. But how common is it for cattle to be attacked, or is there even wildlife in that area that could potentially take down and kill cattle of that size?
Not by coring out the rectum and removing the genitals and removing all the blood with laser-like precision with high heat, which has been scientifically studied. So, yeah, there are predators that can kill cattle, but it doesn't look the same.
Yeah, maybe talk me through, what do these cattle look like when they're found? What is the mutilation involved?
Well, cattle mutilations in the U.S. started, it's fairly famous, 1967. There was a horse called Snippy, also called Lady. The horse, this was in southern Colorado, and that was supposedly the first mutilation of a horse, first mutilation case in the U.S. And then they continued on since then. They were big during the 70s. Like I said, we had a big rash of them in the 90s. And basically, typically the cow or calf is found, obviously dead, drained of all blood. Usually there is something there. In fact, the Shermans, the first 2 cattle mutilations, really the only thing they found, and they felt like they were interrupting the mutilators, is there was a pinpoint directly through the right eyeball, like Terry actually stuck a piece of wire through it. So the eyeballs have something stuck through. Often the ear, something going on with the ear. Either one ear is missing. Sometimes there's a little bit of hide taken out, but almost always it's the genitalia and the rectum that are basically just cored out. A lot of people have a lot of different theories. We'll talk about my mining theory in a minute, but it comes back to cattle mutilations because I feel like the little bit I know about cows and humans and proteins and enzymes, that my theory is that the cattle mutilations are for the ingestion of whatever, the protein and the enzymes, that's what they eat. Whoever this is, that's been my theory for a long time. I mean, other people think it's like environmental, like somebody's studying, or it's in the government. But so many cattle mutilations all over the world, all fairly the same. Also, some of the other things that you'll see with a cattle mutilation is there's often like a glob of what Terry described as like apple butter, like on the cow at some point, like that was part of the process or a residual from the process. And it was similar actually to the little pile of grease that Terry saw when he found the 3 dogs that had been zapped by the blue ball. They kind of turned into sort of the same substance with the same kind of chemical smell. And there's always a chemical smell often with cattle mutilations.
Interesting. Did you say to eat?
Well, so we have to ask ourselves, okay, who's doing the mutilations? Why are they doing it? Are they doing it because cows are similar to humans and they can look at the environment by examining these particular areas of the cow and tell how we've affected the environment, which a lot of people theorize because there were have been a lot of cattle mutilations around. There was a lake in northern Utah that was polluted, I think, and there were a lot around that area. Nuclear sites, that kind of things. Because, okay, well, maybe they're testing what's going on. But what I look at with Uinta Basin is there's also people are hearing machinery underground, and as Sherman's heard that too. Okay, so let's look at it in total. Okay, so you've got machinery underground, you've got ships that are coming and going, you've got creatures that are seen. One crawling through what appears to be some kind of tunnel or portal, right, that was seen with infrared light. This was later by the NIDS people. And then you've got these voices, these disembodied voices that are just kind of laughing at the Shermans. And I will add in some stuff that's off the record, so I can't tell you the detail, but stuff that I've heard and found out about over the last 10 years that tend to corroborate what I'm about to tell you. And that is that my theory, and of course there's a lot going on here, and whether it's another dimension, whether it is like a parallel Earth that exists within our own realm, or if there's a third and fourth dimension, we're occupying the same planet and they can come and go, but we don't have the technology. But my feeling is this, okay, machinery underground, the Uinta Basin, tons of minerals. I mean, that's what you've got out there. There's a lot of mineral extraction, right? All right. So we know that, there's certain minerals that are abundant in certain places, and I think we're learning more about that in the universe. I mean, we're going back to the moon to mine something, right? What is it that we're mining on the moon? I saw that recently. It's like, okay, well, now we decided we need a resource for the moon, so we're going to go back to the moon. But it makes sense to me that this is some sort of mining operation, that this is some sort of species that, for whatever reason, can utilize and finds valuable what is located beneath the Uinta Basin. And another reason I think this is possible, or at least a theory to consider, is because directly behind the ridge where they were seeing the giant UFOs that would just come up above the ridge, well, from the perspective of the Sherman's house, directly behind the ridge where the UFOs were coming, that's Bottle Hollow Reservoir, which is a big body of water right behind it, and people have seen UFOs go down through, but just go into the water and disappear, Bottle Hollow. So my feeling is like maybe there's some sort of connection or base way to get underneath the ground through Bottle Hollow, and that this is just some kind of mining operation where the people are like, yeah, we're just here to get what we need. We're going to leave you guys alone for the most part. But think about this: what if you're a miner and you just were like, what if Americans and we were going to another planet and we wanted to extract the minerals? Okay, well, who would go? It'd be a bunch of like construction worker types, right? Well, if they're bored and they know that there's like some local species that isn't as developed, wouldn't they, like, while they're invisible or whatever, wouldn't they like make a comment, or wouldn't they, hey, let's mess with these people? We got nothing to do. We're on this planet. Here, let's move this woman's towel while the door is locked and freak her out. So I think because there's this whole trickster, prankster element to it all, and I think if you, so I think that's got to be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I remember I was reading Jacques Vallée's book, but even prior to getting interested in this story, and his theory, his kind of like interconnected theory that there's some common source to this phenomenon that kind of relates even back to like folklore of like fairies and the trickster and things like that, of like something out there that has lived parallel to us but plays tricks on us, and it has created folklore and still manifests today, possibly through stories like this. I find that just such an interesting unifying theory for this phenomenon. Obviously doesn't explain anything at this point, but I like your idea a lot. I guess that brings me to another question that I have, which is, have you heard of any other location in the world that exhibits similar phenomenon to Skinwalker Ranch? And if so, have you seen any connection to what it is about these locations? It sounds like maybe in your mind it might be minerals, but have you noticed any direct connection between Skinwalker and any other location that's exhibited this phenomenon?
I think this stuff is all over the world, and Hudson Valley, New York was really busy for a while. The San Luis Valley of Colorado, like I said, where Snippy the horse was originally found. David Perkins, the writer who worked on this a little bit, the guy who did the Spirit Magazine article, he actually lived in that commune in southern Colorado in the late 60s, and he saw a cow mutilation, and he went into the sheriff's department to ask what was going on, and they said, you and your people at the commune are our number one suspects for mutilating this cow. So he was on that side of it. But yeah, it's all over the place. Nowhere in the world, though, I think, and I would say just the Uinta Basin, not just the Sherman Ranch, but I don't know of a place in the world that has more activity than the Uinta Basin has had, because it's much farther reaching than just the Sherman Ranch. If I'm right about Bottle Hollow being an entryway to whatever's underneath, then it makes sense that the Sherman Ranch would be a place where the activity would be concentrated. Because if that's their entry and exit point, then okay, let's go find a cow. Hey, there's one over there on John Garcia's land. Yeah, there's one over there on the Sherman's land. We'll take that one, whatever's close by. So it makes sense to me. But yeah, there's stuff all over the world. There was a guy named Gary Hart from Illinois that I spoke to. In fact, I tried to look him up to see if he's still around. But he had written an article about a place in Missouri that was very similar, and he was onto the whole portal, wormhole kind of thing, just feeling like, there's a vortex of some kind, which may also be the case. Is there a vortex, or is it just the way that whoever these people are, these beings are, that they manipulate science in a way that we obviously don't understand, and maybe it's a portal, maybe it's not, but whatever it is, they certainly have a technological advantage to us. And like I said, northern New Mexico had a ton of stuff going on too. I mean, I'm convinced that any state and any country that I would go to, if I really looked into it, I could find exactly the same kind of stuff. Now, would it be concentrated like the Sherman Ranch? Maybe not. But yeah, there's stuff all over the place. I did find... Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, to your point, if we brought our technology back to the Stone Age, people would be equally baffled by what they would see as to what we are when we talk about this phenomenon. Putting it in that context, I think, helps frame it a little bit, to realize that, technology can seem like magic if you don't understand how it works.
Absolutely. Hey, and I did find that quote I was looking for a minute ago. This is from Terry. This is one that he gave me in that initial interview, because I asked him if they could take anything positive from this 2-year ordeal, and he characterized it as, quote, a bad deal all the way around. He said, all that's really redeeming is that you have some knowledge that a lot of people don't have, for what that's worth. And that was really his feeling about it. He was just disgusted. He was disgusted by it.
Yeah.
He really was. And again, it's not like something happened every single day. Very often it was usually the new moon.
Yeah.
And they feel like, and they saw, they interrupted whatever it was several times, because it seemed like the mutilators would kind of show up whenever a cow was birthing. So like the first time they saw the lights was when they had a cow that was calving in the field, and they went out to attend to her and help her, but they noticed that there were lights in the field, and they thought, this is when they first started seeing them, they thought they were like kids on motorcycles, or somebody's driving an RV around or whatever. And then they saw them again later, and they chased after them after the lights, and the lights were going down to the end of the ranch towards the creek where there's a fence and nothing else. And suddenly the lights just lift up 50 feet and go across the trees and disappear. So
you mentioned a story involving NIDS about a creature that seemed to crawl out of a portal. Could you elaborate a bit more on that story?
There was, and I'm not sure who the people were. I suspect Terry was one of them, because Terry ended up staying on with the ranch for quite a while to help the NIDS investigators. So I'm pretty sure it was Terry, and then probably either Colm Kelleher. They haven't said. This is in Hunt for the Skinwalker, the 2005 book, where they talk about this. But basically, they were looking through infrared scopes, and they didn't see this with the naked eye, but they were. I think they were actually on the ridge, and they were looking down below the ridge, and they saw this sort of auburn light sort of start as a pinpoint and then grow larger and larger, and it was like about 4 or 5 feet off the ground, and then it eventually grew to like 3 feet around or whatever. It was just like illuminated something, and then they see this creature, a humanoid-like creature, crawling through it as if trying to make its way through the tunnel or through the light or however you want to put it. And then this creature comes out, sets its feet on the ground. It's walking now. The light disappears. They don't see anything of this being after that. But yeah, they saw basically a hole open in the sky, although it was just above the ground, and saw a creature come in and out of it. Gwen had, when they were there, another thing that was interesting, Gwen saw one of the small box-like crafts park in the middle pasture, but fairly close to the house so she could see it, and I think she was looking through a scope. But she saw what she described, and Terry saw it later because it came back, but they both saw the same thing. It was an individual who was very large, very stocky. I got the impression 7 feet maybe at least, and dressed entirely in black, like some kind of black suit, along with a visor of some kind, because they could see a reflection from the visor, and they were like in the cockpit, like getting ready to drive this vehicle or something. And I know when I was at the Deseret News, and I told him, because this was going to be a follow-up story, right? And I told him about it, and my editors were like, "This was when the Dream Team was playing for USA basketball in the Olympics," and they're like, "Oh, it's all the NBA players for the first time are playing in the Olympics." Like, "Oh, it sounds like the Dream Team has come to visit the Sherman." But that they had like creatures with red eyes, like 2 pair of red eyes, like look through the windows kind of thing. And at the same time that Ryan Layton knew of this case in central Utah, where there was a 16-year-old who claimed that she had been being abducted by some kind of creature with red eyes. So that kind of correlated a little bit. That was going on.
It's just the story's so strange because there's just every encounter, every story there seems to have something slightly different about it. You look for consistency, but it's just like it seems so erratic in how it manifests, which makes the story just so strange. So we've been referring to the ranch as the Sherman Ranch, but eventually it's become dubbed as the Skinwalker Ranch. How did it earn that name? Yeah, well, I think the first time I saw it may have been in the 2005 book, that Hunt for the Skinwalker. That's really what I think pinned it. So the legend of the Skinwalker, it goes back to the 1800s when the Ute Indians the Sherman Ranch is basically on a very small property that's within the Ute Reservation. So they're surrounded by the Ute Reservation pretty much. And then the Navajos, of course, were located further south. Well, in the 1800s, according to what I've read, the history that I've read, the Utes apparently engaged in some slave trade with some of the Navajos that they, I guess, in battle had conquered or whatever. And so the Utes believed that the Navajo then, because these two tribes were, I guess, warring with each other and taking different sides and whatnot over the years in the 1800s. And so eventually the Navajos allegedly put this curse on the Utes. And it's the Skinwalker, which is like supposedly some people call it a witch. Most people call it like a shapeshifter, where it just kind of shows up and leaves, and it's mysterious and it can take different forms. And basically the Utes really didn't hang out on the ridge too much because that they were told that's kind of the area where it was. But yeah, so that, Skinwalker, and again, I don't think this whole thing is, it's the Skinwalkers. I think Skinwalker is either a reference to whatever these beings are being able to simply, cut through time, cut through space. I mean, some of the stuff that I can't tell you that's off the record involves beings being seen and then disappearing suddenly, just like in a blink of an eye. Okay, so supposedly that is going on too. But yeah, it's a strange place. What would those beings look like?
I don't think they ever got. You mean the ones that the Sherman saw?
Yeah, the ones that would disappear.
Oh, well, okay. Well, there's, I have a great description that I can't tell you because, and the reason is because I've gotten it secondhand and I haven't investigated it myself, so I don't want to repeat it. But I will just say this, there's a variety.
Yeah, interesting.
I just want to say, because you mentioned how sporadic and erratic everything is, and it's hard to put any pattern. Well, that to me, that reinforces my theory that it's like a mining operation, because if you're here from another planet, and you're basically, or another dimension, or the same planet, but you operate at a different frequency, whatever it is, let's don't get hung up on that, okay? Whatever it is, if you're there, you're going to be intent on what you're trying to do, and because I don't think human beings have anything to do with what they're doing. I think we're just kind of here, and if you look at it from that standpoint, then it makes sense, because all of the activity is like, oh, well, we saw something and then it disappeared. Well, obviously that thing doesn't want to be seen, right? So to me, the pattern of all the behavior, including the trickster stuff, really suggests to me that there's something that we don't know that is going on, that is purposeful, that is being conducted by people with higher technology, and we're really not a part of it. And they don't really care about us. They probably are told to stay away, but if we're in the way or they come across us, I'm sure they have personalities just like humans do. What would a human do if they met, a lesser species, to their knowledge, on another planet? All you got to do is watch Star Trek, right? I don't know if there's a prime directive or not. There probably is.
Yeah. So when you were investigating, did you hear anything about stories prior to the Shermans purchasing the land? Was there any sort of phenomenon or knowledge of this sort of activity?
Yeah, there's a bit of a controversy because it was owned, they're the Myers brothers, and one was a doctor there in town. The first Myers, the guy who owned the ranch with his wife for quite some time, I think he died, I want to say 87. And then his wife lived there on the ranch by herself for about 7 years. And anyway, so when the Shermans bought the place, they noticed that there were some peculiar things. Like, for example, every window in the house was like bolted, like you could lock it. Every door in the house had like interior locks, and there was like this panic room in the middle of the house that had locks on the inside, and allegedly like scratches down the, I don't know.
Ominous.
It wasn't there, and a lot of this is secondhand, and a lot of it is not from the Sherman's initial interview because they didn't want to talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's there's no end to it.
Did you say you did interview Robert Bigelow at some point?
Yeah, I went down to Vegas in June or July of '98, and actually went to the National Institute of Discovery Science, and was treated very well. And we toured UNLV. Went to he's got a couple of buildings named after him, and we just talked. And again, he did not want his photo taken, but I think Bigelow's a shrewd businessman. I mean, he made his money basically on fairly controversial, I think, real, like it was a new thing in Vegas, like these 1 week rentals and stuff, and he really capitalized on that. And I know that there were some issues, allegations or whatever that against his business practices back then. I don't know more than that, but to me, it's like, yeah, here's a guy who, he knows how to make money. And again, this guy, okay, well, that's the other thing. It's like, okay, if I'm Robert Bigelow and I'm buying this ranch from the Shermans, I'm not undercutting them. I'm going to pay them what they pay. And I don't know how much the undercut was, but I thought that was kind of interesting. But he definitely seems like someone who isn't going to spend money unless it's exactly, what he wants to spend money on. I mean, he said he's going to put as much as $500 million into Bass, as much, that much of his own money. And again, I don't know if Bass is going to come back or not, but he's got plenty of money, but he wasn't willing to give the Shermans that much.
I'm curious about what his logic around keeping everything. Did he talk on like why he wanted to keep everything so secret? What he was doing there? Yeah.
The argument is that they wanted to, and it's a good argument, they wanted to do everything scientifically. They wanted to observe, record, and do what scientists do. Well, the problem is the ranch doesn't really cooperate because it doesn't give you enough tangible evidence, and it doesn't want you to know this stuff. For example, one thing they did is they put up cameras, 3 different cameras on 3 different poles in the middle pasture where a lot of the activity was happening, and each camera could see the other camera, okay? And then they had one day where just all the cameras went blank, and they went out there and found that and they could look at the other cameras and see what was happening, and it happened in like no time at all. In other words, these cameras were taped onto the poles. They were all recording at the same time, and in one instant, all of the instrumentation from the cameras, the tape, everything was stripped, pulled off. They were all shut down at the same time, and none of the camera angles showed anything going on with the other cameras. So it happens instantly. Nothing can be seen, and the end result is that they can't film anything that's happening in the pasture. So obviously somebody doesn't want them to have the cameras up And whoever doesn't want them to have the cameras up has the ability to get rid of those cameras without being seen in less than a second.
The other weird thing about that is they also know that those are cameras. So if we are talking about a phenomenon that maybe is, not human, somehow it knows that those objects are cameras, which makes it even stranger because it means that they must know about our technology and the way we work.
Yeah, I think they know a lot, and I think they're able to. And again, I don't know what the science is, but it's either be invisible and be where you can essentially spy on humans, know what they're doing. Very omnipresent. I mean, they do. I mean, the things that happen to Gwen, the little things like that, with the groceries being put back up. Who does that, and how can that happen? How can that? It's beyond our technology.
I know when I was reading the book, The Hunt for Skinwalker, that it was mentioned that Terry was actually able to record a few instances of maybe lights or something like that. Did you ever see any of that footage?
No, never saw it. When I interviewed him, they at that point had taken 2 videos. One they thought was pretty good, and they gave it to a guy in town who claimed to be able to do something like enhance it or whatever. And then Terry was just told by the guy that it broke or something happened to it, and the guy was really weird about it. So there was that, and then there was a second video, and I don't think they had either videos when I was there, because the one had already been lost, and the second one I don't think was very good. It really didn't show anything, so I don't think they did anything with it. And then I remember reading, though, in Hunt for Skinwalker that allegedly the Shermans had 5 what they call video fails, 5 different times. I don't know if that includes those 2. Could be 5 separate ones where they tried to videotape or tried to film something and it didn't work. It either didn't come out or the battery didn't work or something. So there's something going on. It's difficult. It's difficult to.
You mentioned that the ranch was eventually bought by Brandon Fugel, who's also a real estate developer in the area. What do you know about Brandon, and what do you know about why he purchased the ranch?
Yeah, I don't really know much. I just what I've read, same as what you guys have read. Probably, he's got some money and he's looking for something that's fun and something he can invest in. And, it's a fun show and he's created a show for himself, basically. And it's pretty cool. Yeah, I don't know what his original intentions were. I think it's incredible that he paid $4.5 million for it.
It's a lot of money.
And of course that's a drop in the bucket for Bigelow, but yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. No, I'd like to talk to him though. I mean, it's great. I'm really glad they're doing it. I really, as I mentioned before, I've got a screenplay that I've written about the ranch, and I think I need to call Brandon and maybe Tom DeLong and a few other people and see if we can get some funding for the Sherman story, because I have the rights to it. They don't, because they send the rights away to Bigelow, unless those have been rescinded, which we need to find out. Because I have a ton, and the Shermans. This is interesting. I think people have asked me if I keep in touch with them. Well, apparently they're back in Eastern Utah now, but they kind of wanted to be left alone. But I did get, in 2010, I was disappointed that I saw it too late, but back before Facebook changed its algorithm, at that time, I don't know if this happened to you, but it happened to me a couple times, where people who are not your friends, they message you, and then it goes to some lost part of Facebook, and then you see it a year and a half later. So Gwen got on Facebook, wrote me a really nice note in 2010, and they were in Idaho, and she just wanted to catch up and stuff. But I saw it a year and a half later, and her account was down, so I couldn't communicate with her. But I did find their phone number in Idaho a number of years ago for someone else, I think a producer or whatever, who was looking to get a hold of them. And I'm sure I could get a hold of them. And if we do end up making the screenplay, I would definitely talk to them and see if they're still under the non-disclosure agreement, because we would love some clarity and more information about what happened. Because I don't think they're inclined to do this, but I wish the Shermans write something. And I want to talk to the kids. The kids were 9 and 13, and the nephew, and they're all grown now. In fact, I have addresses for them. I did. I think some of them are in Utah and some are in Idaho, but I think I could track them all down. But I don't think they just don't want to, it's in the past for them. They just want to live a normal life, which is another reason why it's I really believe what they said. And the thing is, NIDS has substantiated everything. So it's not if the Shermans were not being truthful, it would have been found out very easily. And of course, these things that are being discovered on the History Channel series would not be being discovered right now. It would all have been a made-up story. So,
what are the locals' perceptions of the ranch and the phenomena? Did people take it seriously at the time? And do you have a sense? I mean, I don't know if you've been back recently, but do you have a sense of kind of like how people view it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Uinta Basin is unique because there have been so many sightings and activities over the years, and the Utah UFO Display book came out. Everybody knew Junior Hicks. So I think the little bit of talking I did to local, you've got basically two types. One type that says, yeah, I've seen something, or I know someone who's seen something, I'm very open to it. And then there's the skeptics, and you're going to find that in any community. But yeah, I mean, I think by and large, they got a lot of support because, like I said, the neighbor, John Garcia, had a couple cows mutilated. Other ranchers, other people in the area, really, like a 100-mile radius. So it's pretty widespread. I think people there are aware of it. What are you going to do? I mean, they know, for example, in '98 that Bigelow set up a hotline for all of them to call in with all of their UFO and cow mutilation stories. So I think those at that point would say, well, gosh, at least there's something to it. There's somebody with money here who wants to hear what our experiences are. It's kind of, why would the person be there and be asking questions like this if something wasn't going on? So I think if you're a resident of the basin, I think there are very few people in the basin who would look you straight in the eye and say, oh, there's nothing to this. There's just too much going on.
Given that there's a high population of Mormons living in Utah, is there any connection between Mormon belief systems and their belief in UFOs that may make them more open to these experiences?
Well, yeah, I find it's a curious question as to whether, the fact that there's a large Mormon population there, if that has anything to do with it. I know that the newspaper I worked for, the Deseret News, is owned by the Mormon Church, and I did feel like when I moved to Utah, I felt like, okay, a Mormon-owned paper, they're probably going to be open-minded on this issue. And I did find that the case. What I thought was curious was that the Salt Lake Tribune, which, was in incredible competition with us. I mean, you get the Mormon-owned paper, and then you have sort of more left-wing workers type Salt Lake Tribune. The Tribune never did anything with this story. They never followed up anything. The only thing I could find was they actually did a review of the 2013 rip-off film called, I think it was just called Skinwalker Ranch, which pissed me off because it's like, this isn't the real story. They just kind of tried to profit off of the ranch's reputation, and it just didn't work.
Was that a narrative film?
Yeah, it was about a rancher whose son is lost, like by some mysterious phenomena, and I only made it through the trailer. But it has nothing to do with the ranch at all. But that's the only time the Tribune covered it. And so the Mormon paper was the paper that was running with it. And the other thing is Leslie Whiting, who was the editor of the Uinta Basin Standard, which the Deseret News had a relationship with. And shortly after all these articles were written in about 2000, I got moved up to editor. So I wasn't writing the stories anymore. Liz, she kept writing, which is great. So Leslie Whiting stories were appearing. That's a Mormon community, updates all the time, newspapers saying, hey, we're open to this, and everybody seemed to be open to talking about it. So I don't know. I don't know if the Uinta Basin is heavily Baptist as opposed to Mormon, whether there's any difference. I don't think so. But I think, and again, it's like people are individuals. Some Mormons I've talked to are just totally closed off to it. I know when the missionaries first came to visit when we moved to Salt Lake, I was like all excited to talk to them about UFOs because I was led to believe that the Mormon religion was really open to that kind of stuff. And they are to some degree. Boy, the missionaries sure backed away from that. Yeah. So the answer is I don't know.
Yeah. What effect do you think George Knapp and Colm Keller's book Hunt for the Skinwalker played in bringing the story to the rest of the country? And were you involved with them and talked with them when they were writing the book?
Well, yeah, I talked with George, and they did a great job in the book, I thought, and they gave me a lot of credit for stuff that I reported on, which is great. But basically, see, that book came out, George Knapp and Colm Keller are essentially under Bigelow's control at that point. And I mean, George would probably dispute that, but I mean, basically, they couldn't, because Bigelow was sitting on this stuff and really didn't want anything out. So Colm had been working for Bigelow since '95, and George had known Bigelow for a long time. George, of course, is a Las Vegas journalist and had done a lot of good stuff over the years. So finally, when Bigelow decides, and this is, the book came out in 2005, so we're talking, 8 to 9 years after he acquired the ranch, he's finally okay giving out this information. Yeah, it was great. I think it had a good impact. I have no idea how many copies sold or what have you. I do know that if you look at Skinwalker Ranch online, there's about 12 different books. I think Ryan Skinner, Ryan Burns. I think there's another author that I'm forgetting. Have all written stuff, and some of those guys are just after the fact. This is what we've experienced, kind of thing. But yeah, it's all over the place. There's a ton of IP, and like I said, that original movie in 2013. I think some people think that's the original story, and it's just not, unfortunately. But yeah, the book was great. It was really it was like something like that needed to be done, but it had to come from Bigelow. Bigelow was going to have to say, yeah, go ahead, because he was working with these guys, and Cole Kelleher was like Mid's PR guy anyway. So these are two guys who would be dealing with the public for quite a bit. So yeah, I'm curious to know how many copies it sold now. But it's that helped, and yeah, it's really been an international story. It really hasn't died down over the years. If anything, it's gotten people. There's more interest in it, I think.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We generally, for each season, we cover around 5 or 6 episodes each while we're working on it, and we're doing a story on the Utah monolith. I don't know if you remember that coming up.
Yes, and those guys moved it overnight or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And we interviewed the pilot who first spotted it, and in that interview, totally unrelated, he starts talking about, well, there was this time, I was flying near Skinwalker Ranch and I saw lights above the ranch, and he told us like a full UFO story about the ranch.
Wow.
And we didn't even tell him we were working on this episode, so that was really interesting. And then we were doing another interview for another episode that we're doing on the Sierra sounds. You ever heard of those?
No.
It's like Bigfoot vocalizations in the Sierras that were recorded back in the 70s.
Oh, I think I've heard those. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the people involved was he was relating that area where they were recording the sounds to Skinwalker Ranch. And I was like, God, this is 2 different interviews. Like, I didn't tell them I was working on this episode that all have connected to this story. So I just feel like this story, for some reason, has made such a huge impact on people. They relate experiences to it, weird experiences they've had to this ranch, which I find really, really interesting.
Well, and I think the History Channel series for the last 2 years has probably done more than the book, in terms of getting it out there.
Do you think they've had any security issues now that it's such a phenomenon, like people breaking into the property?
Oh, yeah, they had those issues, yeah. There were security issues at the ranch from the start. As soon as the story went public, before Bigelow bought the ranch, Terry had people showing up. Not a lot. I told you about the guy that went out in the field and whatnot. But yeah, and then they made it more secure. And then of course there was sort of this time in limbo when the ranch was sold. Nobody knew who owned it and all that. And I think throughout that they've always had a caretaker there. They've always had it gated off. I think there may have been a couple instances where they had to call authorities or whatever to get people, just curious people. And initially that did happen. I think when the story came out, people who just came from everywhere, not many, but they would come to the ranch and see what they could find. But yeah, it's been pretty secure. It's hard to get on there to do. But you can look at the ranch from other places, and that's what a lot of people do. And like I said, I feel like, because they saw the UFOs over the ridge, well, the ridge isn't even on, that's on the ranch, but right next to it is Bottle Hollow, and you've got things surrounding it. So there's a lot of territory there where you can see the ranch area without actually being on the ranch. And some people do that. There are people out there now, I think, right, every night that are looking in the sky, seeing if they can find something.
Yeah, I think this could be my last question, and I'll let you go after that. But you mentioned Bottle Hollow Reservoir. What is Bottle Hollow Reservoir, and have there been other phenomena associated with that location other than, you mentioned potentially seeing crafts near it, but is there any other history or experiences people have shared about that location?
Yeah, Bottle Hollow Reservoir has been around I think since the 1800s. I heard some story. The reason they called it Bottle Hollow is because there were soldiers in the area, and they would go get alcohol, and on their way home, they would toss the bottles into the reservoir so that people wouldn't know they were drinking, I guess. I don't know. But I also heard that a lot of people dump junk in there, just like old refrigerators and old cars and that kind of thing. There's one story about, and again, I'm reading it second, third hand down the road, so I don't know how valid it is, but there was supposedly a woman who either drowned or I think she was pulled under by something. I don't know if she survived or not, but that's kind of an urban legend about Bottle Hollow. But the reason I give a lot of credence is because the Sherman saw these ships rise just behind the ridge, and exactly behind the ridge is Bottle Hollow. So if they're not coming up out of the water, they are for some reason hovering over the ridge or coming through something that's above the ridge, perhaps. But yeah, there's a mystique about Bottle Hollow, but I think it's like a recreation area. I mean, I think you can go and hang out if you want and look for UFO.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcasting app. It helps get this content in front of more listeners, which means we can produce more episodes more often. Visit our website at www.strange-phenomenon.com for a full list of sources and more episodes. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at strange_phenom and on Facebook at Strange Phenomenon, all one word. Strange Phenomenon is hosted by Ray Tarara. It's written and produced by RJ Blake and Ray Tarara. Theme music by Tara Monk. Additional music provided by Sergei Cheremizanov.